Hello, everyone. Welcome to this episode of the Mindful in Minutes podcast. I just had a little visitor come knock on the closet door. Poppy, would you like to say hi? Can you say, hi, Dad?
Hi, Dad.
Can you say, hi, Mom? Mama? Bubble?
Hi.
See you later. Go upstairs. Bye-bye. Okay, so that was baby Poppy, although not really a baby so much anymore because she's chatting. But I was sitting in my little closet. Everyone is supposed to be resting, but that is clearly not what's happening. And Poppy wanted to say hi, so that's baby Poppy. I love her so much. Okay, well, moving on. Hopefully that little bit of little baby babble filled us with some happiness and joy, because today we are talking all about optimism. How can you become more optimistic? How can we, of course, use meditation to support kind of this optimistic mindset? And what happens in our brains? How is the brain different from an optimist versus a pessimist? All of this. We're going to be talking all about optimism in just a moment. I did decide on a whim. Right before I was about to hit record, I thought, you know what I want to do? I want to open up topic requests. I don't know why that was so hard for me to think of what it was. What I did, I made a little form. I think I did this 2 years ago. I have one at least from 2023. So maybe, but the questions are, what would you like to see in 2023? So this maybe would have been a 2022 survey. Anyways, I am making another form, and I'm going to link it in the show notes. This is going to be a place where you can request meditation and Freeform episode topics for 2025. So I know it is wild to think about. I don't know where this year went. It was a wild year, a fast year, but January is like right here. And I am in the thick of planning for next year. And I know I did an episode a while back of kind of my process of like planning, and a lot more goes into it than I just like fire up the mic in the old closet and say, what do I want to talk about today? I tried to have like a variety of different topics, a mixture of like 101 episodes, or, making sure that I have like sleep meditations, because I know we love them, but make sure they're not like too close together, all of that. So I'm collecting your requests for 2025 so that then as I sort of plug in my giant color-coded spreadsheet for this podcast, then I can make sure that if there are themes or topics, things that we want explored, that I can make space for that. So all of that to say, I'm going to put a link in the show notes. You can also, if you're listening on Spotify, I just figured out, I owe everyone an apology. I recently figured out, as I'm recording this, how to look at these Spotify comments, and I have to go in and like approve them. I just thought no one was commenting. I am so sorry for anyone who has left a comment. The comments are so kind, so loving, so supportive. I didn't know what button to push to see them. And now that I found the button, also first I had forgotten my login. I sound like my mother where she's like, what's my login again to get into the internet? And I finally remembered my login, and I was like, I'll just see what this comments thing is all about. I haven't seen any, haven't been notified of any. There are over 2,000 pending comments. And I have unintentionally ghosted 2,000 of you. And I shouldn't say 2,000 of you, but 2,000 times I have done this. And I am so sorry if you have been leaving comments and then you're seeing that they're either like just pending or not getting approved, or you're not seeing them under the episode. I just figured out how to access them. And I thought it was kind of funny. I was also a little embarrassed. But I now know how to access them, how to see them. And if you have requests, you can also leave them as a comment on this episode in Spotify as well, or click the link in the show notes. This is where you hit that little plus button or the more, and it'll take you right to the form where you can request topics. And I also want to put in there some ideas for the 500th episode of Mindful in Minutes is coming up. So I'm just put a little thing, if anyone has any ideas for things we could do, fun things we could do for the 500th episode, I would love to hear that. So let's dive into optimism. The reason that I decided this was a good time to explore optimism, one, this is something that I personally want to work on myself. I want to feel more optimistic. I think that this year for me has been a longer year, a tougher year, although I just said it was short, longer in the sense of like emotionally it felt long, even though like in the time lapse sense it felt quick. And I think that when you have even a lot of small things that start to compound where you're like, oh, that, that isn't exactly how I hoped that would go. Or, oh, that's stressful. When you have a lot of those things kind of compounding, and we're actually going to explore this a little bit in the episode as to what happens when we have a lot of these little negative things or a lot of these little positive things building up, how that impacts our brain and ultimately like our mindset, our outlook. And I think I've just been finding myself being like, you know what, I am just feeling a little bit more down, a little bit more negative than I have in the past. And I want to work on it before it becomes a thing. So there's that. Selfish reasons I wanted to explore this. And also we're about to step into Sagittarius season. I am not a full-blown astrology girly. We need Ashley for that. And I loved how much you guys loved her episode and her meditation. I recently downloaded her. She did this thing like a wellness guide for your moon sign, like by proxy through our friendship. I'm learning so much more about astrology and it's really fun. And I'm a Capricorn moon. And so she had this little like guide for like Capricorn moon. Anyways, I've been diving into it and it's really fun. But what I do know about Sagittarius season is that it is sort of a season that's going to help promote kind of this more optimistic spirit. And so I thought, perfect time to dive into it. So here's what I'm thinking for our quick little overview. We're going to talk very briefly about Sagittarius season, what it is, why it's linked to optimism. We're going to talk about what is optimism. And I came across while I was doing my research for this that there's actually different types of optimism. And this really fascinated me. So I wanted to share this with you too. Then we're going to talk about the science behind optimism. So optimism in your brain, all of that, the health benefits of being an optimist. So not only is optimism something that we can see a change in neurologically, but there's a lot of health benefits associated with being more optimistic, which is another thing that I personally want to work on is my overall health. I think that after having a year of sort of being in that postpartum period, having my body sustain 2 bodies, I think it does kind of impact your health a little bit. So that's been on my mind as well. And then evidence-based practices to help you become more optimistic. And then we're going to end with the best meditation practices to boost your optimism or to help you develop more of an optimistic mindset. So that's the outline. I had a delightful time looking into all of this because I was like, these are all my favorite things. We're talking the brain, we're talking healthy micro habits, we're talking meditation. So let's dive in. Optimism, what is it? So if you just Google optimism very broadly, it's defined as a general attitude or mental state that anticipates positive outcomes in the future and believes in favorable possibilities and views challenges as temporary or solvable. So optimists, they tend to look at life and its obstacles with more resilience. They focus on what can be learned or gained from difficult situations. And this doesn't mean that they completely ignore the hardships, but rather they're looking and seeing potential for growth or solutions or improvement. I really liked this definition because sometimes I think we perceive optimism as sort of this like blind optimism where it's just kind of like, oh, everything's going to be fine. It's going to be great. Like this, like, I don't love the word toxic, but so instead of saying toxic optimism, which you will see this term kind of floating around on the internet, I want to say kind of unrealistic optimism, where nothing ever goes wrong or nothing ever needs to be worked on. But I really like this broad definition of optimism where it's not just you're anticipating positive outcomes, but you're believing that these challenges are either temporary or solvable, or they may ultimately lead to something like growth, development, a fresh start, whatever it is. And that resonated with me. And then as I was looking into the definition, I came across this big list. I only included, some of them were very nation specific, but I included a handful of different types of optimism. We're really only going to talk about a couple of these, but it just was interesting to me, so I wanted to share. But I came across this huge list. I want to say it had like 15 to 18 different kinds of optimism, but these are the big ones. So there's dispositional optimism. So dispositional optimism is a personality trait where someone has a general tendency to expect positive outcomes across various life situations. So this is, you're just kind of naturally more optimistic by birth than others. You just have this predisposition towards optimism. People like this tend to approach life with confidence. They think they're going to have favorable outcomes, and they tend to have a higher level of resilience. So there is a component of some people just have this personality trait where they tend to be more optimistic than others. Then there's learned optimism. So learned optimism is sort of this concept that people can train themselves to develop a more optimistic mindset. And this is especially pertinent to people who have a tendency towards pessimism. So learned optimism is where you're consciously challenging these negative thought patterns, reframing them, and then over time, you're developing a more positive outlook. This is the one we're really going to focus on because you think of optimism in general, sort of this like spectrum. It's not like you're either an optimist or a pessimist. Just like maybe you're born with brown hair or blonde hair. You can kind of have this varying degree of like how optimistic are you on this spectrum. So I really wanted to focus on more of this aspect of learned optimism because even if you maybe fall in the middle, this is where I don't know. I feel like I kind of fall in the middle. I wouldn't say that naturally I'm super, super optimistic all the time, but also that I'm not super, super pessimistic all the time. I sort of think of myself as like kind of in the middle and pragmatic, but then depending on sort of which way the wind blows me or my environment, different sort of situations that I find myself in or different patterns, right? Like you have a tough year, it's hard to then not sort of skew a little bit more towards the pessimism, or maybe if everything's going really well, then you might start to feel a little bit more optimistic. I think it's sort of this like sliding scale of how optimistic are you, and wherever you fall on that scale or that spectrum, you can implement these things we're going to explore and maybe increase your capacity for this learned optimism so you can sort of, ramp it up or dial it up a little bit. So that's one we'll be exploring. But there were 3 others that I thought were interesting. One is explanatory style of optimism. So the explanatory style refers to how people explain events in their life. So it just applies to like how you explain things. So people who are this optimistic explanatory style, they really view negative events as like external, so caused by external factors, temporary, specific, like it's a limited just this one area of their life instead of affecting everything. So for example, someone who kind of has this explanatory style of optimism, they might say like, oh, this episode of my podcast wasn't as popular, but overall, I'm still really proud of my show, or overall, I still have a good show, or, that first date didn't go well, but I know I will find someone. So you're almost kind of like explaining these specific things that maybe didn't go as well as you would have hoped and being like, oh, well, that was just kind of this one-off. Or, just because that one thing happened doesn't mean that it applies to everything. And I was reading about this style of optimism and how it can also expand into how you explain things in terms of not just like it impacts this one thing, it doesn't impact everything. But have you ever met someone where every time that, and this goes both ways, every time they're recounting something that happened. For example, I just this week had to take my car into the shop. It was making like a weird noise. You know the drill. I had to take it in, and then they're like, oh, there's this thing rattling around, and did you know that your brakes are bad? And you need, you know the drill. How to take my car into the shop. And this can go kind of one of two ways. So I feel like people have a tendency to, they take their car in the shop, they come back. I'm owning up to this one. I definitely had more. It was actually this car dealership experience that I was like, I think I need to focus a little bit more on optimism. And so I went to the car dealership and there were more things wrong with my car than I thought. And I was kind of feeling like that I came back. And then, of course, they have to, keep my car. And they're like, oh, we're all out of loaner cars. So you're just not going to have a car for a few days. All these things. But then I came home and then my husband was like, how did it go? And I was like, oh, and then this happened. And then the brakes are bad. And then they don't have a rental car. So I don't know what we're going to do for, school drop off on Monday. All of that. And I think that there's also a type of person where it's like they will chronically kind of focus on the things that didn't go well. They will tell a story and they'll recount it and they kind of always sort of skew towards what was bad about it, what was negative about it. This, me personally, I don't want to do that. So when I hear myself doing that, that's when I'm like, okay, pause button, like, let's do some work on this. But I think there's also some people where they'll do the opposite. So they'll have truly this like explanatory style of optimism. Well, they'll recall a story or they will explain something and it's always like the best possible outcome. I see this in parenting sometimes, or, you go somewhere in public with your kids and you're like, well, we went to the grocery store and we had just a little bit of a tricky time when I said that we couldn't buy the donuts and, we just had some big feelings and then that was it. And that is what happened, but you're always kind of skewing towards like, sort of the most like optimistic version of it. And so I just thought that was interesting that optimism can kind of go into how we explain things or recount experiences that we had, either more of sort of that positive view or the negative view. And then there's realistic optimism. So realistic optimism combines optimism with this really grounded view of reality. It involves positive expectations while also acknowledging current limitations or challenges. This type of optimism is really strongly tied to being able to set realistic goals and being aware of what is possible. This is the one that I personally feel like I fall into. Like I do try my best to be optimistic, but also sort of keep these 2 feet on the ground and recognize, the reality of the situation. So this is my personal brand of optimism, although I feel myself wanting a little bit more, needing to just infuse myself a little bit more of the optimism. Then we have strategic optimism. This is the last one that I found to be really interesting. Strategic optimists, they intentionally cultivate positive expectations about their future and then downplay potential obstacles, particularly when it's before like a task or an event. So this approach is often used as a way to reduce anxiety or stress before challenging situations such as exams or performances. So an example of this might be how an athlete is going to really cultivate like these positive expectations. And they're going to be like, I'm going to play the best game of my career, or I'm going to have my best time. Everything's going to go well. I'm going to be in flow. I'm going to, be on fire. I don't know. I'm not quite sure what like the common sports terms are these days, but you get the point. You get where I'm going with this. And it's where you're trying to intentionally be optimistic to help reduce your stress or anxiety before like a big event or a challenging situation. Another example of sort of this strategic optimism, I think back to like when my mom was sick and maybe before like surgery or a treatment, and like you're feeling really nervous about the whole situation and you're just kind of like sort of manifesting in a way and you're like, nope, it's going to go so well. They're going to go in, the surgery's going to go well. They're not going to find any surprises. Like I'm going to recover quickly, going to feel great. My white blood cell count will be boosted. It's like if you have this really tough thing that you're about to do or situation you're about to step in, it's like you're strategically trying to infuse it with optimism because it's going to help you reduce your stress and your anxiety. And I had never thought about this technique as really being something linked to optimism. I always thought of it more as like either manifestation or kind of like sending that positive will into something, getting into a more positive mindset. But having the term strategic optimism really resonated with me. And I was like, that does help to reduce stress and anxiety. It's like you're kind of hyping yourself up and being like, no, this is all going to go well. It's going to be great. It's going to be, exactly how I planned it to be. Whatever you need to hear to reduce that stress and anxiety before that challenging situation or that big event, you can do it with a strategic optimism. So those are some different styles that I just found interesting. I had never really been introduced to this idea that there's all these different styles of optimism or different ways that you can apply optimism into your everyday life to get different outcomes. So let's talk about the brain, our good friend, the brain. All right, so let's talk about optimism and the brain. So the brain of optimists versus pessimists differ in both the structure and the function. So it really influences how each group perceives and reacts to the world. And then, of course, we're going to talk about, and you'll find this as a theme, that these parts of the brain that maybe are a little bit weaker in pessimists are ones that can actually be boosted through meditation and other little habits. So there's different activation patterns in the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex, we've talked a lot about it. It is that part right behind the forehead. And this is an area that when we're meditating, we start to really shift the activity into the prefrontal cortex. But in this area of the brain, optimists tend to have more active left prefrontal cortex regions. This is the part of the brain that's associated with positive emotions, goal setting, and resilience, where pessimists, on the other hand, often have increased activity in the right prefrontal cortex, right? Because our brain has these two hemispheres, left and right. And the right prefrontal cortex, this is a region that's more involved with negative emotions and avoidant behaviors. So this can make pessimists more likely to focus on potential risks and challenges rather than seeking opportunities. Now, the amygdala. We know her, we love her. We talk about her a lot. The amygdala is the pain, fear, worry center of the brain. So this is the part that processes emotions like fear and threat. It's going to respond differently in optimists versus pessimists. So optimists typically have reduced amygdala activity when they're faced with potential threats, meaning they're less likely to have like those big, giant physiological responses and anxiety responses to perceived threats or triggers. Pessimists, on the other hand, you probably guessed it, they have heightened activity, which can amplify these negative emotional responses. So pessimists are more sensitive to perceived danger and are more prone to experiencing anxiety and stress. Now, within our brain, it's not just necessarily the different areas of the brain, but there's also a difference in dopamine. So dopamine is the neurotransmitter involved in like motivation, pleasure, reward, and it tends to be more active in optimists. So the brain circuits involved in processing dopamine, especially those related to like sort of the reward, anticipation, and fulfillment, it's more easily activated in optimists, helping them feel more motivated by the promise of a good outcome. Where pessimists, the dopamine response, it might be less pronounced, meaning they may feel less motivation or pleasure when considering potential positive outcomes. So this can lead to like overall lack of motivation and an increased focus on potential disappointments. And I thought that was so fascinating. There's also a different bias in this thing called the default mode network. I think the default mode network kind of needs its own episode in a way, but very high level, the default mode network is a network of interconnected brain regions, and it becomes active when our minds are at rest. This is when I was learning about this, I was like, oh, ding, 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 I'm fascinated. I want to know more about what's happening in our brains when they're at rest. So when we're not focused on like any kind of a specific thing or like external task, this default mode network plays a key role in self-referential thinking, daydreaming, recalling memories, envisioning the future, and reflecting on our experiences. So think about it as like you're just kind of hanging out, not doing a whole lot, not focused on one particular thing. Your mind's just sort of wandering. Maybe you're dreaming. This happens to me sometimes when I'm just listening to music. It's like just kind of dreaming. The mind is, flowing, kind of floating wherever. This is this default mode network. So this default mode network in optimists, it has a tendency to generate more hopeful, favorable scenarios. So even how we like daydream or let our mind wander, if we are an optimist or tend to be more optimistic, even our daydreams are going to be more optimistic versus a pessimist, their default mode network, it may lean more towards negative projections, things like self-doubt, creating mental images that focus on potential failures or problems rather than these possibilities. So this tends to lead towards a cycle of negative thinking, which reinforces this pessimistic attitude and thoughts over time versus if you have more positive or optimistic thoughts, daydreams when the mind is at rest, it might help to compound and kind of create this cycle of positive thinking, which is so interesting. There's also some different things here, some research on, how pessimists tend to have like higher cortisol levels or have some more mental health struggles versus like optimists tend to have like more protective effects against like anxiety and depression. But I want to dive a little bit deeper into the health repercussions of being a pessimist versus an optimist. And also, I want to pause for a moment here because all of my pessimists may be listening to this. And of course, you're a pessimist. We're pessimists. We're thinking and we're like, oh, great. So now my brain is bad and my brain is not working the way it's supposed to, and I'm more likely to have mental health struggles and higher cortisol. And I'm going to talk about, these sort of health benefits of being an optimist versus a pessimist. And if you find yourself already in that spiral, right now, we're going to just together take a deep breath. We're going to hit the pause button. Because once we get through all of this, this is me. Did you hear me just switch into like calm down mom mode for a second? I do this with pork chop. I'm like, ooh, okay, buddy, I can see we're having some really strong feelings now. That's okay. The strong feelings are okay. And then I move into, how are we going to move through this together? Because something that I have been thinking a lot about and learning a lot about, I don't know how this would necessarily like work its way into an episode, but we'll see, is how our nervous systems develop when we're little, but also how co-regulation leads to self-regulation. This is like my one sort of ADHD tangent I'm going to allow myself for now in the first, 30 minutes of the episode. But when we think about how we regulate our emotions, I didn't realize this, but so much of how we personally as adults self-regulate was dependent on how our parents helped us and allowed us to co-regulate. For example, pork chop, he's 3 and 3-year-olds are already, pretty volatile. Their brains are still developing. He's either going through or about to go through this thing called the limbic leap, which is where our limbic system, which has a big component of like emotion regulation, things like that. It's going to start working independently and it's going to start like developing, which can make even the most mild-mannered kids be, a little spicy. But anyways, I've been learning a lot about how our children learn how to, and I think about, even if you don't have kids, think about how you regulate your emotions, how well you do, or maybe how tricky it is for you. That can be linked back to how your parents helped you learn how to co-regulate first. So pork chop's having some strong feelings, as he calls it, having some really strong feelings in this moment. Maybe he's upset about something, angry, frustrated, whatever it is. You have to teach him how to co-regulate. So that might be giving him a hug, and I just take some big deep breaths or saying something like, oh, those strong feelings, they feel so big, right? Validate, being like, oh man, that's so tough. It would make me too. It'd make me mad too if, baby Poppy came and took my Paw Patrol toy when I wanted to play with it. And then I would then model, how to regulate my own emotions or kind of walk him through it. That's this idea of like co-regulation. You regulate their emotions together. And then over time, co-regulation will then turn into his ability to self-regulate. And we don't have the capacity to truly self-regulate at this age when we're this young. But so much of what we learned or didn't learn about how to self-regulate our emotions in those big moments boil down to when we were like toddlers and what our parents taught us, and if they modeled how to self-regulate. So I don't know. I have found that to be fascinating. And also it feels like a lot of pressure because I'm like, oh my gosh, this is going to like impact his, his regulation skills for the rest of his life. But something to think about. If you have a hard time with that regulation, maybe think back to some of your earliest memories and like when you were upset, how did your parents respond to that? And knowing that none of this is necessarily set in stone. You can still teach yourself how to self-regulate. And meditation is great at helping you with that emotion regulation piece. You can still change the way that you do these things, but it might not necessarily be like all your fault because, I don't know, just food for thought, something to think about. So what are the health impacts of being a pessimist? So pessimists tend to have heightened stress and chronic cortisol elevation. So pessimists tend to keep body in this prolonged stress state, right? It doesn't feel good to be thinking about the negative impacts. It doesn't feel good to always be thinking doom and gloom. And again, I'm not saying that it's easy to be like, okay, well, let's not think doom and gloom right now. We also know that we tend to have a bias towards negative thinking because it's part of our survival mechanism. I can't remember what episode it was, but we were talking about how we tend to have this bias towards negative thinking. And it's because in many different instances, right, if we think about, oh, the last time that I went to this place, I felt uncomfortable or I felt unsafe, I want to avoid it next time or not go there anymore, that potentially could be saving us. So when we have these sort of pessimistic thoughts or these negative thoughts, it's not always necessarily bad, but we're designed to look for the negative in things because our brain can interpret that as like, how are we going to keep ourselves safe? So if we tend to have this heightened sort of stress, this prolonged stress state, it's going to give us high levels of cortisol over time. This isn't just like, little snapshots here and there. It's like over time. And then this chronic cortisol exposure, it can lead to things like a weakened immune system, increased risk of like some cardiovascular stuff, heart disease, also higher inflammation levels. So pessimists are associated with elevated levels of inflammatory markers, which we don't want that. We don't want a weakened immune system and higher inflammation. And this is where you can give yourself the pessimist test. Are you like, oh, great, now I'm going to die young because of all of these horrible things that I'm doing to myself? If you're thinking that, just make a mental note of it. Just say, you know what? I'm going to keep listening because I think I need a little support shifting out of the pessimism and moving a little bit more towards the optimism, which we're going to get there. Also, pessimists tend to have an increased risk towards things like depression, anxiety. A lot of it has to do with thought patterns, right? Really focusing on those potential risks, the failures. And they tend to have lower emotional resilience. So if we tend to be more pessimistic with our thoughts, we're more likely to experience emotional burnout. Who hasn't experienced a more emotional burnout at some point in their life? And then we also can tend to have poor coping mechanisms. So, maybe not like things that we necessarily want in our life. So we're going to look at the health benefits of optimism. So it's pretty much the opposite of everything that I just listed. But optimists tend to have a calmer physiological response to stress, lower cortisol levels, basically then we tend to have healthier hearts, enhanced immune systems, decreased inflammation. Also, people who are optimistic or have more optimistic thoughts, they tend to have lower rates of depression and anxiety, also improved emotion regulation and resilience, and they tend to have slower cognitive decline. So there's some studies that suggest that optimism may be associated with a slower rate of this cognitive decline in older age, and they think that this might be due to the reduced chronic stress, and also optimists tend to have healthier social and physical lifestyles. So they tend to be more social, they tend to be a little bit more physical, a little bit more active, maybe engage in some more positive self-care and health practices. They also have enhanced recovery for illness, so they tend to bounce back from illness, also recover from surgeries, things like that a little bit faster. I remember this was something that I believe it was my mom's oncologist said, is that people who have a more positive outcome, that they tend to heal a little bit faster, also higher blood cell counts. I remember specifically my mom's oncologist talking about how even though things didn't look good and they did not look good for her, that having that positive mindset has been linked to a better outcome. They tend to also have lower risk of chronic diseases and greater longevity. So all of that we love. And again, they think kind of the longevity piece or like the mental decline really has to do with reduced stress and better lifestyle choices and also greater life satisfaction. So that I thought was just really interesting. And then again, optimists, they tend to have better social connectivity. So they tend to have better social relationships and support networks, where pessimists sometimes have a tendency to like self-isolate, kind of get into that, mental spiral, all of that. So yeah, I want that for you. I want all of those things for you. I want everyone to have this strong immune system, be socially connected, bounce back from illness faster, have a really slow cognitive decline. Like, I want all of that for you. So let's talk about how you can start becoming more optimistic. First of all, if you're like me, you're like, okay, how long is this going to take? Like, what is the time commitment to starting to rewire my brain towards optimism? The internet tells me that it's going to take between 6 to 12 weeks. I believe this because when we look at even meditation, and people ask me this all the time, like, okay, Kelly, how long do I have to meditate until my anxiety is going to feel better? And it's usually shorter. It's less than sort of that, with meditation, it's kind of that 8 to 12 week mark where people really start feeling some relief from their anxiety. You will feel better in the moment, but we don't see the neurological changes until more of that like 8 to 12 week. That's why when I wrote You Are Not Your Thoughts, I wanted it to be this like 8-week minimum kind of guided journal, is because we know we need that to start seeing actual neurological changes in these key areas of the brain. So I do believe that when we're thinking about rewiring our brain for anything, it tends to be sort of this 6 to 12 week. I would say like 8 to 12 week is more common time frame where we can really see some of these neurological changes. So 2 months, and we're going to dive into some little daily, short, simple things you can do to start working towards that more optimistic outlook. The first one, and this is huge, is practicing gratitude daily. So regularly noting things you're grateful for can help you shift your brain's focus towards the positive. So gratitude activates regions of the brain that are associated with things like dopamine. We, talked about that. Reinforcing these neural pathways that lean towards positivity. So even ending your day with a little bit of gratitude, a daily gratitude list in the morning. Sunday's meditation is a kind of unwind or end your day with gratitude practice. Gratitude is huge for building an optimistic mindset. Another practice you can do is reframing your negative thoughts. So you're going to challenge your pessimistic thoughts. You're going to consciously reframe them. So when you catch yourself thinking negatively, right? So, I going back to the car dealership and being like, wow, that wasn't what I wanted to hear with my car. Now my whole day is ruined and everything is bad. And this always happens to me. I always go to run one small errand, and before I know it, I'm out of a car for 5 days, whatever it is, right? When we find ourselves thinking like that, we're going to go, oh, there it is. Pause, reframe. So instead of, I always fail, this always happens to me, we're going to reframe and say, ooh, that's not what I expected for today, but better things are going to happen later today. Or if we're thinking, I always fail, we're going to go, pause. It's not I always fail. I'm learning as I go. We're going to give it that little positive spin. We're going to just, first of all, recognizing when you're having these thoughts. These are huge. Also the same for like anxiety, anything that you're really trying to reduce that's very like thought-based, intrusive thoughts, things like that. You're going to go, oh, there it is again. Okay, pause. It's like you catch it, and then you're going to reframe it with something that's a little bit more positive or neutral. A neutral perspective is very much, a better outcome than the total just doom and gloom, like thought spiral. This is also going to strengthen that default mode network towards more hopeful future thinking. So even if you're just kind of relaxing, you're not doing a whole lot, you're taking a shower, you're sort of driving, listening to music, and you find yourself really thinking about the negative, going down that spiral, you're going to go, oh, pause, reframe or reset, focus on something either neutral or a little bit more positive. Meditation is great for this. People who meditate regularly report being happier, more optimistic, and more compassionate. And this is something I have thought about. I kind of want to explore maybe compassion and compassion building too on an episode. But maybe if you want to fill out that Google sheet that is in the in the link in the show notes, and you want to hear more about compassion, let me know. So people who have a regular mindfulness and meditation practice mindfulness, I think, is really great for helping you in the moment. And then meditation, I think, is phenomenal for like actually rewiring the brain. So meditation can help regulate the amygdala, right? Reducing this emotional reactivity to anxiety and stress triggers. And meditation also helps strengthen the prefrontal cortex and kind of the way that the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala talk to one another. We know this, right? We know that when we meditate, we quiet down the activity in the amygdala and we send the mental sort of work and activity to the prefrontal cortex, which has a lot to do with our emotion regulation, emotion management, all of that. So meditation is great. Specifically, some practices like loving kindness can help to increase positivity by focusing on compassion and well wishes for yourself and for others. Also, any guided meditation that is like specifically around happiness, joy, optimism, positive thinking, that's obviously going to be great in it as well. Positive affirmations or positive mantras, this can absolutely be a part of your meditation practice. Positive affirmations help to gradually shift sort of that explanatory style, right? So instead of really internalizing those setbacks, we're seeing them as more temporary and specific. So repeating affirmations like, I can do hard things, I am capable, resilience comes to me easily, positivity is within me and around me. Something that you may want to do if you're not like driving or anything, you could even hit the pause button right now and either write it down or put it in like the notes app of your phone. But write down like 5 positive things you could say to yourself or 5 positive things you'd like to hear in that notes app or on a Post-it. And then this is something you could say to yourself like every day or 3 times a day, maybe before you're about to eat a meal, you say these positive affirmations to yourself. Having positive affirmations or mantras in your meditation practice can be really helpful as well. So this is something that we see, these positive affirmations. It really reinforces the neural circuits associated with optimism and positivity, also with self-confidence, which is interesting. Surrounding yourself with positive people is another one. So spending more time with people who tend to be optimistic and positive. There's kind of this idea of like positivity is contagious. And we know that there's actually this psychological phenomenon where emotions spread among individuals. So you really can feel someone else's energy or emotions or feelings, and then you start to take that on, right? If you've ever gone into a space where everyone is just like really feeling down, right? You can feel it like right away versus you go into a room where like vibes are high, everyone's feeling good. You can feel that as well, and it can be contagious. So maybe just doing a little bit of a person audit in your life or a time audit of how much you're spending around positive people versus more negative people and seeing, is there a way I can surround myself with more positivity through the people that I am connected to? And then setting small, achievable goals. So achieving small goals, it releases dopamine. Again, we're talking about dopamine again and again, keeps coming up when we think about optimism. And it reinforces the brain's reward system. So setting these small, achievable goals, celebrating progress, and acknowledging each accomplishment, this strengthens motivation and a sense of capability. So really making it easier for the brain to expect these positive outcomes. I have gotten very into sticker charts for myself. I know this is something that like sometimes we do with toddlers, but if I set a goal, for example, if I set the goal of, let's say 50 podcast episodes in a year, I'll make a little sticker chart for myself. And every time I finish one, I'll go and I'll put like a little sticker on that chart, and I can look at it and be like, oh my gosh, I did another one. Like, check, now I only have 49 to go or whatever it is. And then I have these like little sticker charts for different goals that I have sitting like on like taped to the wall of my office. And then I have a bunch of just like random stickers for my kids. I don't know, it's kind of fun. And then I just recognize like every time, like that act of like putting a little sticker on there. I'm like, oh, I did it. I did another one. And it feels good. And it's helping to release that dopamine and reinforcing sort of the brain's reward system. So I put into sticker charts. If there's something else you want to do, great. But setting these small, achievable goals and then sort of acknowledging every time you get one step closer to it is a great way to start moving towards more optimistic thinking. Let's talk about how meditation supports optimism. So we know that meditation helps us become more optimistic, but I want to talk about the why and the how. So meditation helps to calm the nervous system and reduce stress. So meditation is activating the parasympathetic nervous system, the rest and digest, which really helps us to step out of that fight or flight mode and into more of a state of calm, right? And we know that this sort of stress reduction, it allows the brain to move away from that more survival focused thinking, which is where a lot of the negativity gets fueled, and it creates more mental space for positive, hopeful thoughts. Meditation can also help lower your cortisol levels, which is great, and it helps protect against chronic stress, burnout, and helps you to become a little bit more resilient. Meditation has also been shown to help counteract negative thoughts. Things like mindfulness meditation is really good at that. It teaches us how to stay present and observe our thoughts without judgment. This is where we can take a little bit of a thought audit or take inventory of our thoughts and recognizing when we're having these negative thought spirals or making note of patterns that are happening in our thoughts. And we can do something about it before it escalates and really spirals and like gets out of control. So over time, mindfulness, observing our thoughts through mindfulness meditation or present moment meditation. I would even say any form of meditation too. When you get distracted or the thoughts that pop up in your mind, just make note, positive, neutral, negative. Again, without judgment, and then just look for the pattern where most of my distractions or thoughts that popped up during my meditation, positive, negative, or neutral. And then over time, we can start to notice the patterns and start shifting more towards positive thinking, possibilities, things like that. The meditation and the brain. So we know that meditation helps us strengthen the prefrontal cortex. This is the part of the brain involved with emotion regulation, decision-making, positivity, and a stronger prefrontal cortex, which over time, our prefrontal cortex does get bigger and heavier, gets more gray matter, more neurological activity, again, after about 8-ish weeks of regular meditation. If we have a stronger prefrontal cortex, it gives us greater control over our reactions and making it easier to choose an optimistic response over a pessimistic one. It also helps to reframe these tough experiences and encouraging more constructive thoughts and a more positive outlook on the future. At the same time, meditation helps to reduce amygdala activity. So amygdala, pain, fear, worry, anxiety center of the brain. Meditation helps to reduce activity in the amygdala. And if you remember, we go back to the beginning of the episode, optimists tend to have less reactive and smaller amygdalas to begin with. So if we can decrease activity and size of the amygdala, it can help us to manage our fears, our worries, and our anxieties more effectively, also making it less reactive. So we're less prone to like these big anxiety responses. And there's also benefit in what I would put as like optimism meditations. So these are going to be like optimistic, positivity, specific meditations. So visualizations for a positive future. Picturing yourself like walking into a positive future or visualizing a positive outcome. Even just visualizing positive surroundings in your environment can be really great for a meditation practice that's going to push you more towards that optimism or positive thinking. Incorporating affirmations or mantras into your practice. So saying things like, I welcome positivity into my life. Everything I need is already within me. I trust good things are coming my way. Everything always works out for me. Whatever you want to say, incorporating these affirmations or mantras. And if we remember, again, I can't remember exactly which episode it is. Probably, I want to say Mantra Meditation 101. An affirmation and a mantra, the difference is an affirmation is just a positive phrase. A mantra tends to have more of a spiritual component to it, but they're both positive phrases that you can say to yourself. And then mindfulness of positive emotions. So bringing your awareness to the sensation of like these positive emotions. So maybe sitting there and just allowing the sensation of happiness, positivity, peace, calm, confidence, whatever emotion you want to focus on, really embodying that. So feeling it within you, visualizing it pouring out of you, maybe seeing yourself going through a day where you're, really living with this positive emotion. That is a great practice for sort of boosting that optimism and then continuing to reinforce that long term. Loving kindness meditation we talked about, great, because you're really, activating positivity, compassion, love, care, really great, warm, fuzzy feelings. Also, the practice of sort of visualizing or writing your optimism story. So this could be something where you're in your mind, maybe you have, again, this is just fresh in my mind because I was just at the shop getting my car worked on, visualizing a positive outcome. So even though I didn't want to, lose my car for a few days and spend way more money on this, and I'm like, oh, I didn't really, I went in for this weird sound. I didn't know the whole brake system had to be replaced. But sitting there and then maybe meditating and thinking about like, you know what, universe, thank you for, and it might, before I say what I'm about to say, especially if you have a tendency towards pessimism, it's going to feel funny at first. You're going to be like, oh, do I really believe that? It's going to feel a little funny at first, and that's okay. But sitting there and being like, you know what, universe, thank you for making the door to my car rattle. So I brought it in for the weird rattling sound because that then uncovered the fact that, and the rattle is not associated with the brakes. This was a, and also, did you know your brakes are bad kind of a situation. But thank you, universe, for giving me the door rattle. Otherwise, who knows how long I would have been driving on these bad brakes and something awful could have happened. So thank you for making that door rattle. So I brought it in and realized there was actually this like unsafe issue with my car. So kind of scripting or writing this optimism story, things like that, reframing, that can be really helpful for this. And you can do this in your meditation practice. So you could take a few deep breaths, quiet the mind, relax the body, and just see something that you're working with and sort of write a more optimistic story around it and visualize that. So as we're wrapping up here, big key takeaways for optimism. It's a small little micro habit of a build. So just doing these little things throughout the day is going to help to rewire your brain for more optimistic thinking. Meditation, maybe tweaking your meditation practice a little bit. So you're doing some of these practices that have been shown to help promote a more positive mindset, positive outlook. There's, great things to being an optimist, but any of my pessimists listening, it's okay. It is not all doom and gloom. We can work towards a little bit more optimism because, again, it's sort of that spectrum. It's that sliding scale, right? Maybe we're finding that we're really, having a tougher time. And I get it. I'm not here to tell you that it's bad that you're feeling pessimistic at the moment, right? But thinking about, okay, is there a way I can start to turn up the dial so I feel a little bit more optimistic? Maybe you're currently finding yourself, you already feel pretty optimistic, but you want to be even more optimistic. I don't know. Do with this information what you will. And the big thing is just start small. Create a little micro habit for your optimism. Since we're in this Sagittarius season, that really helps to support positivity. Also, as I'm just recognizing now, I think the thing that I meant to start with, I think I forgot to mention it. So we're going to end with Sagittarius season. Sagittarius season, which starts on November 22nd. I don't remember myself saying this, so I think I just skipped this part of my brain. It's November 22nd through December 21st. We're just about to step into Sagittarius season. This is all about, okay, now I'm like in real time realizing I think I started this thought and I never finished it. So I guess that was technically my first ADHD tangent of the episode. And then the other one about, co-regulation was my second. Sagittarius season broadly, so this season is associated with like a sense of adventure, expansion, optimism, even like travel, learning new things. So it's like, you know what, if the stars are kind of supporting this optimism, learning new things, this expansion, why not explore it? Why not let that support be there as we sort of work on these things. Sagittarius season is about like curiosity, big picture thinking, seeking truth, seeing life as an exciting journey. Again, these are all really kind of optimistic things, and seeing our lives as like being filled with possibilities. So I thought this was the perfect time to really lean into that energy of optimism. And I've also been hearing from a lot of you too that you need a little bit of help with that. So I thought, let's do it. Let's explore it. So thank you so much for being here. There is that doc. I'm going to make it right now and then link it in the show notes if you want to request certain topics for 2025 for Mindful in Minutes, because I just truly, as I was sitting in my little closet, plugging in my mic, I just was like, oh, I get to like sit here and chat. I get to record Mindful in Minutes, which is one of my favorite things that I do. And I just love hanging out with you. I truly do. It's what it feels like. I love hanging out with you. I love getting requests and then just creating what it is that you want and need. You know my intention. Maybe you don't know this, but every time before I sit down and I hit the record button, I set a little intention of like, may this episode reach the person looking for it, or may this meditation reach the person who needs it. And I just want to hear, what is it that you're wanting to learn about? What is it that you need? What do you want? So I can just create that for you and then have another beautiful year of getting to do what I love and creating these practices and helping to support you. So link in the show notes, or now that I know, you can comment on Spotify and I know how to see it now. And thank you for being here. I hope wherever you are that you have a beautiful day.